Caden was not born a commander, but he was born to be one. Aline, of course, recognized this straight away. After graduating to the Protectorate, she personally oversaw his training, recognizing a potential that, quite frankly, everyone else saw as well. Caden, however, was far more fragile a being than others may have assumed. Without his pillars, he quickly would fall to despair. This, Aline recognized also. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 3. The Wolf in the Woods. Caden. Hell is out there. This would be the second time in one night. My morals were really slipping these days. It was good that I didn't feel like stopping them. That would have been hard. I knocked on her door briefly before deciding to just throw it open. We both knew who it was, and why I was here. At least she thought she knew. Either way, there was no sense in honoring the formalities at this point. She was sitting on the edge of her bed waiting for me. She'd known I'd come, and I knew that I didn't like what that said about me. She was dressed as high class as her room was decorated. Lace curtains, lace underwear, silk bed sheets, silk nightgown. She was damn near beautiful, and that wasn't a word I used often. She stood to walk over to me, but something felt wrong about this. It felt wrong as she pressed herself against me and pressed her lips against mine. It felt wrong as we backed up towards the wall behind me, and I spun her around, pressing her against it as I kissed her neck. And by God, did it feel wrong when I ripped the silk dress off effortlessly. It felt so right, however, when she scratched down my exposed back and I tossed her over to the bed. That was why I had to stop. It shouldn't have felt right. She looked up at me from her position on the bed, begging me to continue. "You're not drunk." "Huh?" she asked with confusion. "I'm a slut, not stupid," I responded, walking towards a curtain and ripping it off the wall and throwing it at her. "Your eyes are not nearly dilated enough for you to be drunk." "I thought you were going to say that my breath didn't smell like alcohol," she responded, sitting up completely sober. "That too." "So you won't spend the night with me because I'm sober?" "That takes a gentleman," she commented sarcastically as she covered herself up. "No, I'm not in bed with you because you thought acting drunk was the way to get to me." "It almost worked," she said, lying back down. "Yeah, almost," I said, taking a step back and leaning on the wall we'd been up against moments earlier. "Now sit the fuck up," I demanded, crossing my arms. She listened instinctively. Commanding men, and women, was in my blood. "What?" she asked, completely surprised. "You're coming out into the woods with me," I commented. She could see where this was going. "That means you're under my command." "If you want me, you don't have to order me to," she started. "Shut up!" I needed to be rough with her. I couldn't have her knowing why I'd actually stopped myself. "You need to be briefed." "Okay." "Okay, sir," I corrected. "Now you are about to come into the woods with me, and you are scared. Don't argue with me, because I'm bloody well scared every time I set foot out there, and I know you are too." I paused for a moment. "That, or you're just stupid." By now, I'd stood up, and I was starting to pace in front of her. God, I was a fucking stereotype. "There is darkness out there, and it's far beyond what we're capable of understanding, let alone fighting in such small numbers. When we are out there, we are the prey. There is danger everywhere. If you slip up just once, you will die, and you will not die well. It will be slow, it will be painful, and you will be lucky when you finally pass." I stopped my pacing to make a statement before resuming my stride. "Point is, don't get separated. You are scared, and it is right for you to be scared, so by God, be damn terrified." I could see the fear in her eyes that she was hiding so well. "There is an unstoppable evil out there, and trained though you may be, you are being thrust out there unprepared and inexcusably ill-equipped." "You aren't very encouraging," she responded quietly, looking down at the ground. I walked up to her, placing my right hand below her chin and lifting her gaze. "No, I'm not," I responded gruffly. "But I am sincere." I softened my voice. "Stay close to us. Don't slip up, and you should be fine." I released my grip on her chin. "Now get some sleep," I said, lightly pushing her back. I turned to walk out of her door and only hesitated when it didn't fall closed behind me after a couple of seconds. "Kate?" I heard her call. I was afraid of this. I'd scared her too much and hadn't reassured her enough. She acted hardened enough, but she was green and I knew it. I turned and walked back to her briskly. She was surprised when I put my hands on both sides of her head and pressed my forehead against hers. I looked her in the eyes with all the sincerity I could muster. "You know our mission?" "Yes," she responded softly. "Yes, sir," I corrected. "You'll stick to it invariably?" Yes, sir. She was catching on. Then stay close, I said calmly, and I'll keep you close to me. She knew I could be beaten. My recent injuries from the wolf proved it, but there was always something comforting in knowing that someone was watching over you. My strength came from protecting. Most everybody that knew me long enough knew that. Okay, she whispered, closing her eyes. Perhaps she thought I was going to kiss her, but she was wrong. Sleep well, I said, releasing my grip on her and walking away solemnly. I felt her watching me for a second. I thought I heard her whisper the words, "Thank you," as she closed the door, but I couldn't be sure. I still knew how I felt about her. I hadn't fucked her, which meant something. Despite what many others may think or say, Alpha was not a sadist, nor did he enjoy torture. He was, however, dedicated to his country, and even more so its leader. He'd been driven to the edge of his insanity through pain and agony, and she'd been the one to drag him back. But, back to the point. He did not enjoy torture. He was just very good at it. And nothing is more torturous than watching your abuser enjoy it. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 3. Continued. Irina. The Wolf's Bloody Lair. She had seen the end, and the end was darkness. She'd fallen down the tunnel and been scratched and battered by the roughness of the slide, only to reach a 20-foot drop cushioned by rotting corpses. She'd finally rolled off of the pile, only to be racked with dry heaves, eventually ending in her vomiting bile. The smell down here was unbearable. She was too injured to go anywhere before the wolf would arrive, and she knew it, but that didn't stop her from trying. Around her, in this high-ceilinged large cavern, were dozens of tunnels of equal size, all dimly lit by large torches kept burning from the fat of human remains. She had held her side as she stood. Her abdomen was beaten beyond what she ever felt before, and though one of her eyes was swollen closed and freely flowing blood, she was determined to start moving. She picked a tunnel at random and began to make her way towards it. The wolf had beaten her so easily, broken her spirit, fractured her body, and kicked her down into this hole like another worthless corpse. She'd hardly made it to the opening of her decided tunnel before she heard the combined moans of the creatures that served the wolf so faithfully. They came from every tunnel, hundreds of them, surrounding her. She frantically spun in circles, hopelessly looking for an escape. No, she whispered to herself as they grew closer. She was in no condition to fight them. Please, no. There was panic in her voice as they reached her. They groped for her, grabbing her arms, digging into her skin. They grasped at her hair, ripped her armor clear off, and tore at her clothes. She felt as though she was being pulled in every direction at once, all of her skin burning as their claws ripped at her flesh from underneath the rags of clothing. They smelled of death, and their skin was rotting off of their bodies. Their mindless howls of pain and anger shredded her sanity. She tried to keep her eyes open. She tried to fight against the combined strength of hell itself, but she wasn't going anywhere, and her screams would do her no good. Suddenly the pain began to lessen as the creature seemed to back off, retreating back down the tunnels, leaving her on the floor bruised and in a bloody mess. She rolled onto her stomach, crying out from the mere exertion. She tried to drag her mangled body forward as the sound of footsteps approached from behind her. "Come now, Irina, that will never do," said the voice of the wolf as he stepped behind her. Despite her helplessness, she still dragged herself forward across the rugged stone floor. All of a sudden she felt a burning sensation cover her skull as the wolf grabbed her by her hair. She screamed as he pulled her to her feet. All the while she cried as she grasped at the wolf's hand, trying to support her weight in any other way. The wolf turned her to face him. She was covered in gashes, literally from head to toe, and the scraps of clothing that still hung to her covered nothing private except for a piece that immodestly covered her lower region. These scraps only clung to her from the wetness of her own viscid blood. She grunted and clenched her teeth together, glaring at the wolf, trying to hide her fear. Now, girl, if you keep giving me looks like that, I'm going to have to break you," he growled, delivering a short punch to her gut. She doubled over as much as was possible with the wolf holding onto her bloodied, tangled hair the way he was. He dragged her behind him, cutting her heels and thighs on the rough ground. Finally, they reached one of the jagged walls. He thrust her against it forcefully, knocking the wind from her lungs as he placed one of his clawed hands around her throat. With the other, he grabbed onto her left hand. Her head swung down, overwhelmed by the pain. He did what should have been impossible. He drew her hand away from the wall before thrusting it back with all of his might. The force of the impact shattered every bone in her hand, wrist, and forearm to dust, embedding it in the stone wall. She screamed as her head shot up, tears flowing from her eyes. The wolf switched hands, drawing the other one back and repeating the process right as she'd stopped screaming. This time, when she looked to the ceiling and opened her mouth, no sound came from her. Her mouth quivered as her body tried to deal with the pain. Her legs almost buckled beneath her, increasing the pain in her arms tenfold, as blood seeped from the cracks where her arms were now embedded. The wolf took a step back as he drew his sword. She looked towards him with her eyes brimming with tears, and willed the pain to stop as she gasped rapidly, like someone who'd just finished a marathon. "We can't have you trying to run away now, can we?" the wolf asked, turning his blade until he held it like a bat. She tried to say something, but her mind was filled only with pain. "You see," he began, swinging the sword diagonally with all the force he could muster. The blow landed against her right shin, snapping the bone raggedly in half. She cried out as her leg unnaturally folded sideways, bone protruding from the side. She sobbed uncontrollably as he drew the sword back again. "Down here," he continued, "I have the power to keep your mind functioning, even when pain should have overwhelmed you. I'm talking about that off switch that your body has when it experiences too much pain. That switch that'll turn you off before you go insane from agony. The switch that I control down here," he exclaimed, pausing for a moment. "And you, my dear, are going to be awake for a very long time." He swung again, shattering her other leg in the same fashion. Her breathing was ragged and her vision blurred, but she remained conscious. She began to choke on her own breath, hacking and coughing and sobbing from the pain until she wrenched and vomited all over herself onto the cold floor. "Down here," he whispered, bringing his mouth closer to her. "I can even keep you from dying," he finished, drawing back his left gauntlet-covered hand. He jabbed forward. Her eyes shot open and her mouth formed a silent scream as his fist tore through her visceral organs. She couldn't make a sound as the agony shot through her body. She cried as he twisted his hand, causing her to lose all control over her bodily functions as tears flowed freely. Finally, he took a step back. She should have been a corpse. Every inch of her skin was covered in blood. Her face was virtually not visible behind the blood, snot, bruises, and tangled matted hair. Her neck bled from several gashes. Her chest was hardly recognizable through all the gashes and holes. Her hands were lost to the wall, and only sporadic rivers of blood coming from the cracks proved that something of hers was in there. Her stomach was utterly eviscerated, and when blood stopped flowing in the intervals following her weakened heartbeat, the wolf could even vaguely see her organs. She'd lost bladder control when the wolf had twisted her insides, and bone stuck out of her shins like thorns from the stem of a rose. She gasped raggedly at odd intervals, still sobbing with all the strength she had left. "You humans don't know what hell is," the wolf growled, grabbing her underneath the chin. "You think this is bad?" he snarled, slashing his claws across the left side of her face, cutting straight through her eyelid and destroying her left eye. "It could be so much worse." He howled through the sounds of her screams. She shook her head, completely in shock, trying to open and close her eyes. "Stop it!" he roared directly in her face. "No matter how strong you are," he growled in her face as he took a more wolf-like form. "Insanity, depravity, futility, it doesn't matter what finally breaks you," he whispered. "Because one way or another, my dear, you are going to be very, very useful." He turned and strode away from her, leaving her halfway blind and wholly mangled beyond what should have been possible. She heard the creatures returning as the wolf walked away. "Have fun with her," he whispered as he disappeared down one of the tunnels. "No," she whispered as she watched them approach through what was left of her vision. "Please, no," she whispered. "No, God, no," she cried as they came within a few feet of her. As they reached her, she cried out and screamed with all of her might. Only one word escaped from underneath the earth, traveling up the chute through which she'd fallen, echoing into the early morning. The terrible, agonized scream scared the birds from their trees, cawing as they took flight. No. Levain? Levain? Levain. Yeah, that boy had no future. Which isn't to say that the poor thing shouldn't be pitied. I'm not saying that he deserved what he got, but had he been left alone long enough, he would have earned that fate over time. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Chapter 3. Baterish, Levain's First Confessions. Confession was a regular occurrence considering the mandated religion practiced within the castle walls, and much of the forest. In reality, the confessions were mainly done so that Lord Varen could keep an eye on his subjects. After all, treason was a sin, and if one neglected to tell the priest all of their sins, there was a nice spot waiting for them in the burning abyss. Baterish had always handled the confessions as far back as anyone could remember. However, with Levain lined up to be his predecessor, he would be taking at least some of the confessions that day. The procedure was simple. The priest would sit alone in a dim, candlelit room upon an ornate, small, yet comfortable chair. The priest of the temple, Baterish being the priest of the commanders in royal court, would be dressed up in his typical robes, but would wear a hood with a thick and impossibly dark veil. The room itself was a circular shape, with a radius of about 3 or 4 meters. The walls were dark earthen colors, and candles of various heights lined them, glowing many shades of silver and blue. The ceiling was about 5 meters up and was a grated material. There were about 20 of those same ceilings stacked almost on top of each other so that the smoke could vent, yet sound stayed trapped. The walls and doors were thick and soundproofed as well. The priest would remain silent whilst the citizens would stand, sit on the floor, or pace around the room confessing their sins. At the end, the priest would simply say, "The Almighty hath heard your sins. Go now forth and be at peace." Aside from tithe, donations, and a bit of faith, the confessions were one's ticket to a glorious afterlife. The outer door closed loudly, with Baterish already in his chair. "Lust, Baterish, lust!" The voice was distinctly male. Baterish responded with what was demanded of him by the code. Silence. Utter silence. I mean, among the usual things. Wrath, insubordination, and patience. Not sure if killing those things wandering around the forest is murder, but... The man finally stopped pacing about. Maybe murder too, he said, taking a seat on the ground. Lust, though. Definitely lust. He sighed, zoning out a little. "The Almighty..." Baterish started. "She's got a bite, Baterish," the man cut in. "Honestly, she's just beautiful. I mean, I'm not sitting around thinking about laying her, but I wouldn't pass up the opportunity. I can't stop thinking about her." Is it truly lust, then?" the man said as he thought for a moment. "Nah, take lust off the list." "The Almighty hath heard your sins. Go now forth and be at peace," Baterish finally finished. "Well, I've done this before. I'm sure of it. I just don't much remember it," the woman said with hesitation in her voice. "Well, I'll start with hate." Silence. "Fury," she began as she started to pace. "Loathing, detestation, dislike," she started to yell. "Distaste, abhorrence, aversion, revulsion, contempt," she finished as she took a seat. "And wrath," she said with her voice completely calm. "The Almighty hath heard your sins. Go now forth in peace." She stood quietly and left, without a sound. "I'm scared." She sat quietly with her legs crossed from her position on the ground. "I know that's not a sin, but I feel as though my fear will paralyze me out there." She sighed deeply. "All of my life I've faced my fears with brutal efficiency. I've trained for this moment, that entire time, and yet I can't help but be afraid. I don't think there is a way to be prepared for this, and that terrifies me." She was quiet for a moment, contemplating her words. "Fear is not a sin to the Almighty, but hate is, and I hate myself for my fear." She stood and turned to walk away. She grasped the door but stopped. "Cade said he'd protect me." She sighed with a soft laugh. "He can't even keep himself safe. He said he'd protect me." She opened the door. "I trust him, though. He'll keep me safe." Baterish hadn't even gotten to say his line, but she knew the Almighty had heard her. Baterish heard many more confessions, Lord Varen's included, before allowing Levain to take over. Only 3 confessions remained. Levain found himself being anxious to hear the private sins of the people around him. He would have made a terrible priest. I walked through the overly ornate halls of the upper floors of the castle. It all bothered me. They were so spoiled, so unbelievably incapable of living without their lavish accommodations. The hall I was in now stretched a good 30 meters to the ceiling in an elaborate arc. The walls were stone with a gray-blue hue, the colors of the Lord, and deep blue banners with Lord Varen's crest, ironically enough it was a wolf, lined the walls with brilliant silver trimmings. Every step I took made a loud echo that reverberated off the stone due to my combat boots. I was supposed to be wearing the more ceremonial, showy armor that the Lord had presented to us upon our arrival, but I hung to my battle-hardened armor nonetheless. I was still covered in bandages, but as always, I'd cleaned my armor almost to perfection. Only the dents and dings that I couldn't easily knock out remained. I wore the typical Alathian colors, which coincidentally matched the colors of the house here. My armor was gray, but my sleeves, undershirt, and cloak were dark blue. Alathians, such as myself, didn't typically wear helmets. Instead, I wore a white cloth around my forehead, keeping the blood, which dripped periodically from my cuts, out of my eyes. I did a sharp left face, pausing for a moment to stare at the door that led to the confession room. It was a plain wooden door that was decorated, or as I would have said, smothered, in silver trimmings that wove elaborate and sporadic designs. I understood why Aline had required that we attend these confessions. It was good for the people that you were serving to feel like you understood them, accepted them. Hell, if you could be one of them, it was always best. At the same time, it was such a waste. I should have been out in the woods doing what I did best, and maybe even slipping in a rematch with the wolf. Instead, I was sitting through pointless council meetings, attending confessions, and wading through waist-deep horse shit while Irina was out hunting the wolf. I knew she was probably already dead, but I wanted to be out there looking for her anyway. After all, if I just so happened to be in the woods recruiting, I might as well do a little searching. I wasn't abandoning my post, was it? I found that my resolve to stick to my duty had faltered a bit. I didn't like it, but I suppose that I had been strong when it counted. I threw the door open, causing it to slam, blowing out a few candles in the process. But Teresh jumped. He never jumped. I noticed quickly that the breathing pattern of the person in the chair was all wrong. The intervals were off. It was Levain? Once again, I had looked a little too deeply. I didn't need to study breathing patterns to realize that this shorter and sweatier kid was not Baterish. I smiled. I had a feeling that this was going to be very therapeutic. "He threatened to kill me!" Levain screamed as he threw off his ceremonial mask. "What's wrong this time?" Baterish asked, looking up from his desk. Levain had just very rudely barged into his office, and he was looking less than happy. "Caden!" he yelped, throwing his hands up. "He thought I was you, and he said, 'Oh, does he talk to you about killing me in every confession?'" Levain demanded, not waiting for an answer. "And you didn't tell me!" he squeaked as he slammed his balled-up fists onto Baterish's desk. "He knew it was you," Baterish responded calmly. There was fire in his eyes, but for now it was staying in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Levain asked in desperate confusion. "He was playing a prank on you," Baterish sighed. "I don't understand," Levain said, shouting, throwing his arms up. "He wants me dead! Have him arrested!" "Child!" Baterish shouted, standing up behind his desk. "He was fucking with you!" Silence followed as Levain's jaw hit the floor. Baterish never cursed. "You have one more confession. Now get in there and do it," he said, returning to his seat. "But it's the treasurer, Levain," he sighed. "The worst he could possibly do is throw money at you." Levain had fallen victim to more than one nightmare about large sums of coined money being thrown at him, but it wasn't a phobia that he was likely to admit he had. Levain was back in his seat. He had done so cautiously and nervously, but he had nonetheless returned upon Baterish's command. He listened intently as the door slowly swung open. The treasurer was an older man of about 50 years, and in all the time Levain had been in the castle, he realized that he'd never even heard the man speak. Perhaps out of all this hell, at least his curiosity could be fed just a little bit. The door shut quietly as the treasurer guided it into its proper place. "Awful things, priest," the treasurer said in a rather kindly, fatherly voice. "I have some awful things to tell you about." It had been remarkably easy for Alpha to slip in unnoticed. With a name like the Wolf, people rather expected to be on the lookout for a giant wolf. A couple of stolen robes, a fake limp, and a dead treasurer later, Alpha was in, and he had a surprise for these people. When he first entered the confession room, he noticed that the priest was already visibly shaking, and for a second he thought he'd been had. However, he quickly came to the conclusion that whatever had scared this boy wasn't in the room anymore. "Awful things, priest," he said in an even tone. "I have some awful things to tell you about." He took a deep breath. "You see, I've been rather naughty of late." He paused for dramatic effect. "Oh, what with the murder of Innocence, the disemboweling of a small child, and I can't forget about the brutal and agonizing torture of that beautiful young lady that Caden was kind enough to send my way." The priest was visibly shaken, but was torn between wanting to get the mask off of his face and the paralyzing fear of what he'd find if he took it off. Like a child under a blanket, the priest chose to cower underneath his mask. Alpha decided that now would be as good a time as any for a nice menacing growl. "Speaking of our mutual friend Caden," he growled as he grew closer to the priest and began to shift into his more wolf-like form. The priest's terror was exhilarating. "I have a message that I'd very much appreciate you delivering to him," he rumbled, clawing at the ceremonial mask. Alpha smelled the pungent odor of urine in the air over the scent of the candles. It appeared the priest had messed himself. "Oh, never mind," Alpha hummed absently, grabbing the mask with his right claws and positioning his left further back. "I'll tell him myself," he said, pulling off the face mask. He stared at the priest's rather young face before speaking. "Boo," Alpha whispered as the priest released a faint whimper before fainting. "Ah, well, that's no fun," the wolf said to the air around him. He placed his left-clawed hand over Levain's face, drawing back his index claw and tapping it down straight through Levain's skull, before mixing the poor boy's brains around with his claw like a whisk in raw eggs. "No fun at all," the wolf whispered as he gashed open the priest's stomach. "He was going to need a lot of ink."